This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
Welcome to the Friday morning break with John Gibbs. My guest this week, Emeritus Professor of Policy Analysis and former head of the Department of Management at the London School of Economics and Political Science. We're going to discuss, how did our education system get to be like this?
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
And we're back with my guest, Professor Gwyn Bevan, who, as I said in the introduction, is a professor at the London School of Economics. He's also had an illustrious career as an author, a lecturer, and advisor to the government on numerous committees, from the inspection of police and fire services, an education commission of the Rockefeller Foundation, and numerous other posts. He's an expert on public services, health, education, and the police. His current research includes comparisons of performance in health and schools across the UK. And a recent book, How Did Britain Come to This? A Century of Systematic Failures of Governance. And that will provide some of the basis of our discussion today. Although I'd like to concentrate on education, I'm particularly interested to talk to Gwyn, as I don't think it's just me, but I'm going to guess that out there, if you're listening this morning as we approach the Christmas holidays, that something is seriously wrong. Schools aren't working as they should, and I don't know if you'll identify lack of spending, austerity, government cuts, incompetence in the government, or something deeper, something in the historic development of our attitude to education and indeed wider public services across the 20th century. And it's this area that I want to explore with my guest this morning, Gwyn Bevan. He creates a narrative of the 20th century, particularly since the Second World War, where we see what he describes as historic failure. And I think most of us would agree that something is indeed very wrong. So, Gwyn, welcome to Teachers Talk Radio, and welcome to my show on Friday morning, the Friday morning break.
Great to be here. Thank you very much, John.
Well, as I said, as we briefly talked before I started recording, I've been sort of what they call it these days, stalking you online. I've been watching some of your lectures, and I've been reading your book, and you give a very good account, it seems to me, of how we got to the situation we're in, and from the context of the schools. And as I was saying to you before we started recording, one of the experiences I had in teaching was to see the world of education and public services generally, but from my experience of teaching, see it transformed by the values of the market and neoliberalism. And you give a kind of narrative of why that came about. And so how did we get to a point sometime in the 1980s where the market seemed to be the answer to everything, including schools?
What we've had are what I describe as these two major political settlements of the 20th century, which was Clement Attlee's government after the Second World War, this was all about tackling William Beveridge's 5 giant evils of want, disease, squalor, ignorance, and idleness. And that government was focused on developing systems in place to tackle each of these different problems. So, I mean, that they enacted the Butler Act of 1944 that moved the school system from one state school system, one based on elementary schools, to age 14, to our systems of primary. And it was the first time you actually had free state secondary education in this country. But it was an extraordinary achievement what they accomplished under very difficult circumstances in those 6 years. But what they designed was designed for the problems of the 1930s. So by the 1970s, these were beginning to show signs of failure. Hence, Margaret Thatcher's government, elected in 1979, promised a radical change. But the big difference between her settlement and the Attlee settlement is, if you think about the five giant evils, there was William Beveridge, a liberal, designed system of social security. R.A. Butler was a conservative Minister of Education, designed the Education Act. Maynard Keynes, a liberal, set up policies to tackle employment. And Aaron Bevan, my famous namesake, developed policies for the NHS and council housing. But it was non-ideological, whereas the Thatcher government was completely ideological. It was all about markets. And as you were saying, John, the underlying belief is market solution to all our problems. So if we look at the school system, there were two things there's the way the system was designed, which was, well, as you will remember this, it looked to be very rigid. Parents basically had no choice. The school you went to was the catchment area you were in. The school funding was determined incrementally based on past budgets and did not adjust depending as the numbers of pupils in the school changed or as their needs changed. And also there was no system to tackle things that were going wrong. So a failing school could continue to fail for a generation. I mean, the village I live in, which is just north of Oxford, it said the primary school head teacher there loved watching tennis. So in Wimbledon fortnight, the whole school would watch tennis. And no one, we had the 11 plus at the time. I wasn't here then, but no one from this village passed the 11 plus while she was head teacher of that school, So we had no system. It was all based on trust. We can trust the teachers to do a fantastic job. Now, of course, most teachers go into teaching to do that because they've got this mission. I'm sure you did. It's a wonderful thing. We all know this when people understand things they did not understand before and see that development. But as in all walks of life, as they say, there are some people who frankly can't be bothered. And we had no way of getting rid of that. And the big scandal that sort of put it all in the public domain was at William Tyndale School, which you may or may not remember. But this was a school where it was taken over by, this would be the lefties so loathed by Margaret Thatcher, who decided it was up to children whether they wanted to learn or not. And one child at the inquiry famously said, "You don't learn nothing at this school," So the attraction of the market that they introduced was, you're going to introduce choice of parents. You can now choose your school. Money follows pupils, so the funding of the school reflects the pupils that you've got. And as my friend and colleague with whom I have a continual disagreement on this is Julian Legrand at LSE, argues that his attraction to the market system is that if you're in a school and everyone's doing phenomenally well, you transform the lives of your children through fantastic education, you will thrive in the market, you get more money, you get rewarded. And if you do a really terrible job and can't be bothered, then parents will take their children away from the school. So his argument is that what we're doing here is what he calls the other invisible hand, is that the market mechanism will correct these. This looks to be a much better system than the one that we got from the Attlee government.
Yeah, one thought occurs to me there is that it's an odd paradox, really, because the markets, one of the effects of markets is they produce innovation. In other words, if a thing doesn't work, you're going to go out of business, so you try something else. So innovation is always thought to be a sort of characteristic of private enterprise and markets. And
yeah, absolutely, yeah.
And yet, if you leave teachers to do their own thing, you'll get William Tyndale School, you'll get bad teachers, but you'll also get creativity and teachers in their classrooms doing it works because I know it works, and so on. You'll get you'll get the kind of create. So oddly, there's a sort of paradox. In order to introduce the market, they had to direct, the national curriculum from above. So in order for you to innovate, we have to tell you what to do. It seemed to me an odd paradox.
Well, that was seen at the time as a controversial decision. You're right. There's a contradiction with neoliberalism, because within the ideas of neoliberalism, where people have free choice, schools should choose their curricula and parents could choose schools with different curricula.
Hmm.
But the other thing going on here, which relates to the point you were talking about, which is the school league tables, is that what they wanted to do was to inform parents on the quality of education they got in their schools. So that's why if you have a standardized curriculum and school league tables, you can see how well different schools are performing and make an informed choice on that basis.
Yeah, and yet one of the experiences I had was that schools became. I mean, when I first started teaching early on in my career, I went to quite a few schools. One school I taught at the longest was, in its day, would have been thought of as progressive, comprehensive school. There were no school uniforms. There was a great deal of autonomy in the school, for better and for worse. There were things wrong with that, and so on. But they played around with the timetable and so on. As the years went by, that school and all the schools I knew became more similar. Uniforms were introduced. The national curriculum was imposed with greater and greater efficiency, and so every school became kind of the same. So what you were trying to be the best at was being the best at being
well,
the
the thing
same.
is, if you introduce, I mean, what happens once you introduce? Well, as you know, these school league tables of performance, in which you're in competition in that way, then it does put enormous pressure on you to achieve the standards as set by the government, which your performance is measured. I mean, the point, the issue I have here, though, this will not be so popular with you and your listeners, is that as my name implies, I am actually from Wales, and most of my work is in healthcare, and we've had this natural experiment in the NHS of the different countries having different systems of governance. And that also, of course, happened with schools when, after devolution in 1999, the Welsh government, this was actually under pressure from the National Union of Teachers, underwent a consultation and decided to abolish publication of school league tables. And there was this careful econometric experiment led by Simon Burgess at Bristol, comparing schools in England and schools in Wales. And what he showed was that the stopping publication school league tables in Wales meant that pupils in Wales were disadvantaged compared with similar pupils in England in terms of getting good GCSE results, 5 good GCSE results. And he was stunned about the power of the impact that he saw of that. It was like 2 grades per student per year at GCSE for every year they stopped doing it. And what really troubles me about this, because my family are from a mining valley in South Wales, so the only reason I'm still alive now and at LSE is through education. It got me to escape from that, is that what they found was that the best schools in Wales, this would be in the socially advantaged areas of Wales, stopping school league tables had no impact on them. The places where the pupils suffered were in the deprived former mining valleys of South Wales. And so you've got this contradiction of, a socialist government saying, we are the true socialist, unlike the Blairites. So we're not going to punish our teachers through this pressure for school league tables. But then the people who lose out are actually the children of the poor. So it's quite a complicated process. So I think
I don't think the teacher audience listening to this will be too offended by the idea of accountability. I think that it was that idea though that the best form of accountability was a rather odd idea that somehow bad schools would fail and good schools would thrive in a market. Well, that was never going to work, was it? That was just daft.
The big advocate of markets for schools, it's a US scholar who was at Harvard. I think she's now at Stanford, Caroline Hoxby. And the problem with neoliberalism, where the conditions for the market to work aren't satisfied, And one of the ones that she identified is the one you put your finger on, which calls supply side flexibility, which is that failing schools will exit the market and the good schools will expand or new schools will come in. And that doesn't happen, of course. First of all, the government's not prepared to fund a vast number of places in excess of the children we have in schools because of budgetary constraints. And that means you don't have supply side flexibility. So the failing schools, this is what the Institute for Fiscal Studies found. The SINC schools will operate with something like 90% capacity because pupils have to go somewhere. So actually they're underfunded for the capacity that they've got, but they don't close, they just linger on. And the good schools that are oversubscribed, one of the criteria of being a good school is you are oversubscribed. So you do not want to expand capacity because that's going to impair one of your indicators of your success.
You are listening to the Friday Morning Break with John Gibbs on Teachers Talk Radio. My guest this week, Professor Gwyn Bevan. We are discussing, how did schools get to be like this? It made me laugh with recognition when I heard you. I think I've heard you say that or read that, and that was the idea. Of course, you're absolutely right. You want to send your kids to the school where it's difficult to get in. You don't want to send your kids to the school where everyone can send their kids to that school. It's scarcity is a kind of desirable value.
Absolutely, yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's what Fred Hirsch called a positional good, which is the positional good is different from normal goods. So the contrast we have is with healthcare. If everyone gets fantastic healthcare, the quality I get is not impaired. If all our children get a fantastic, that was the issue we had when you expand university education, where the trouble is I can't track it down, but I think one minister said we want to send 50% of our adolescents to universities so they can get the 25% top jobs. It's not going to happen like that, and so by expanding university, you then get the Russell Group emerging as a group of elite universities, and then you have to get a graduate degree, so it's this scarcity is what you're into in education, which makes it so complicated.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishing professional development books and resources to support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Have you checked out their latest releases? Use the code JCTTR2324 for 20% off your order. Don't miss out. Visit johncattbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles and advance your own professional development today. Happy reading.
In today's educational environment, students and teachers are juggling a mix of face-to-face, online and blended learning courses. Canvas by Instructure helps teachers navigate these diverse learning experiences with a user-friendly virtual learning environment that offers flexible access to courses and a consistent learning experience, all while streamlining everyday teaching processes. The world's best schools and universities are using Canvas to create dynamic courses, collaborate seamlessly, and access actionable data that drives student success.
On the 24th to the 26th of January 2024, Bet UK is back, and even better for educators. New for 2024, Table Talks empowers educators to collaborate openly and connect deeply with like-minded individuals in the education space, as well as tech user labs, the brilliant new tutorials and working groups at BET, where technology users will learn how to get more out of their institution's tech from the top education technology experts in the world. Whatever your goal, you'll find it at BET 2024. Educators go free. Get your tickets today at www.uk.betshow.com/visitor-registration.
I know that some countries in the world experimented with, and it was even considered, I think I'm right in saying it was considered vouchers were considered a possibility in this country. Essentially, you completely marketise the system. Parents are turned into consumers.
Yeah, well, that's Chile. That's what Chile did.
Yeah, and well, I don't know enough
that's
to say it didn't. I'm guessing it didn't work.
That was terrible. Well, it led to these huge protests in the streets in Chile. It's called the Penguin Revolution, where the children took to the street. What happens then is, goes back to one of the high priests of neoliberalism, Milton Friedman. He argued for vouchers for schools. This is back in the 1950s, and it was implemented when there was, they killed Allende, they assassinated Allende, the Marxist president of Chile, and President Galtieri came in, a close friend of Margaret Thatcher's, it must be said,
Yes.
who imposed these policies of neoliberalism and introduced a voucher system for schools. So, and Milton Friedman's argument is that, if you want to spend money as a parent on going to a good restaurant or having a nice holiday, you're perfectly free to do that. But what you won't let people do is spend their money on a better education for their children. Now, of course, you can do that in the independent sector, which is hugely expensive because the state doesn't, you have to pay the tax for the state education and private education. So Friedman said, what we'll do is you'll get a voucher, which is the state will cover all the basic costs of education, and there'll be state schools you can go to, which will just take the voucher and go to these top-up schools where you pay a bit more and you get education. Now, of course, the way he argues that is that this is simply that the voucher schools get more money. But what it also does is to, of course, introduce serious social segregation. Because the children, the way it starts off is, you can easily afford to pay the voucher. They introduce the system. You will pay a voucher to send your child to the voucher school because they're going to obviously get a better education than not. But after that, the voucher schools have got children from the better off parents who are concerned with their education. They will attract really good. It's a nice place to go and teach. Unlike the voucher schools, which have got deprived children, whose either parents can't afford or don't care about their children's education, So in the extreme case, I remember one of my students at LSE saying his partner taught in a school where there were children whose mother was a drug addict, whose father was in prison, Now, you know what it's like to teach those sorts of children. They're not going to be in the top-up school. They'll all be in the voucher schools. So the next step you get to is, even if you can't easily afford to send your child to a voucher school, there is this huge gulf between these two different schools, and you will do all you can to afford to pay to send your child to the voucher school. So then the gulf just widens over time. So you get this huge social segregation then. So the voucher schools not only got more money, but have got pupils that are easier to teach.
It's an odd piece of sort of I think it's cognitive dissonance or something that people would, if you ask them, would you like every local school to be as good as every local school? So just take the worry away. Your local school is the best school for you. They say yes, but then they'll behave to get some advantage for their children. I probably did the same for my children. You then think, well, that school's slightly better than that school. What can I do to manipulate the system to get them into that? And soon enough, you're creating an inequality.
Right, yeah.
You desire not to have that equality, but you'll create it. It's kind of we'd rather not pay taxes, but we'd also like to have wonderful social services. It's kind of sort of paradox. Is what happened going back slightly in time? So in the 1970s into the 80s, why did that post-war Attlee settlement fail? I mean, you've mentioned one thing, the failure of accountability and choice and so on. People desired that, but why were the wheels coming off that era?
Well, it was a series. What I argue is that the two different things that played out basically, but one of the what I describe as the linchpin of the Attlee settlement, and you have to remember this is looking back to the 1930s now, when there were horrendous rates of unemployment. In the lecture that's been recorded, described the Jarrow March of 1936. In Jarrow, they closed the shipbuilding works there, and there was 70% unemployment. And in the valleys of Wales, it was 40. This is terrible unemployment, and people in grinding poverty as a consequence. And the greatest economist of the 20th century, John Maynard Keynes, was arguing that the government needed to do something. And stop me, John, if this. But basically, it's a very simple. Like all these things, once a genius has spotted it, you can easily see it. Which is that the government believe you should balance the budget. So once unemployment increases, you lose taxes, and you have to pay out social security benefits. So you lose income, and the expenditure goes up. So you have to cut expenditure, and you cut expenditure, and government expenditure. That then creates unemployment, which reduces, and so on. And so he showed that the Treasury in 1930, we should not interfere with the economy. It will return to full employment in the long run. And he showed that was completely wrong. That what they were doing would perpetuate unemployment forever, basically. And he said the government needs to intervene. So the promise of the Attlee government was, we will deliver a high and stable level of employment. And that continued for what it described as the 30 glorious years from 1945 to 1975, at which point there were various oil crises and it was mismanaged, and unemployment increased. And so Margaret Thatcher's famous poster in the 1979 election campaign was of a queue of unemployed men outside a labour exchange. And the line is Labour isn't working. So it just symbolised, the failure of the Attlee. I mean, there were other things as well. So that was the key failure there.
So it was. So in the late 70s, you've got this, stagflation. It shouldn't happen, but we've got inflation sitting to the side. Prices are going up and inflation's going down. That shouldn't, according to Keynes, that shouldn't happen. And so on. So there's an economic crisis now. Then this revelation, sort of as it were, Milton Friedman, Chicago School. The answer is markets. Now, what are the signs that is coming to an end? That has run its course.
Well, I think the trouble is that one of the consequences of that was, that Margaret Thatcher did not believe that government should interfere in any way with the markets for employment. And Milton Friedman persuaded the government all you needed to do was worry about inflation, control the money supply. And then shortly, I'll make this very short. Basically, North Sea oil started flowing into the country. And unlike Norway, the government didn't manage the currency and didn't manage manufacturing industry. So we wiped out, all the areas that are now left behind. There's a process of deindustrialization that did not happen in Norway. And the Thatcher government believed that somehow that, as in the 1930s Treasury view, the market will reintroduce unemployment. And we've got these now profound entrenched inequalities between different parts of Britain. And that is one of the horrendous failings of the neoliberal settlement, are degrees of entrenching geographical inequalities in the UK without parallel in other developed countries. So that's one sign of it. And it is you've got this, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation showing 1 million children are destitute. It's just our failing public services are falling apart all over the place. It's just not working.
Yeah, that statistic, I forget where I first saw it, of the widening gap between the number of enormously rich people, the people who are paid numbers of amounts of money that would have seemed silly money years ago, and the boardroom to shop floor gap widens and widens and widens. And as you say, then there's when that phrase leveling up first appears, so you're saying that's a kind of acknowledgement that something is seriously wrong, that the market doesn't produce evenly good results for everybody.
Yes. Well, the contrast that we've had, is what's happened in Germany. Because in 1991, you had the fall of communism, and GDP per capita in East Germany, this is the cross East Germany compared with West Germany, was about, this is gross domestic product per capita. It's an indication of how well off individuals are in different parts of Germany. And the people in the East were only a quarter as well off as those in the West. The recent analysis, this is, I think, 2019, shows that the poorest regions in the East are now at the same level as the poorest regions in the West. So Germany has gone a long way towards levelling up. But vast amounts of money was transferred from the West to the East. This was not a market doing this. There was strong government intervention. And what I do is to compare, the Germany, where you'd expect to be substantial inequality because of communism, and Italy, where there's this famous north-south divide. And the ratio from richest region to poorest region is threefold in each of these countries, where we know we'd expect there to be huge inequalities. And in the UK, it's an eightfold difference between inner London West and Teesside.
Yes.
And so Teesside GDP per capita is something like £22,000. In inner London West, it's £190,000. And if actually you look within inner London West, the richest region in Italy is Bolzano, which is in the north. It's got a population of 500,000. If you look at the parts of inner London got a population of 500,000, the richest ones, their GDP per capita is £340,000. That's 17 times what it is in Teesside. It's just, and the other thing, of course, is because of what's happened with the financialisation of housing. You can't move from these. If you live near Nottingham, moving to London, it's just not possible.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishing professional development books and resources to support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Have you checked out their latest releases? Use the code JCTTR2324 for 20% off your order. Don't miss out. Visit johncattbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles and advance your own professional development today. Happy reading.
In today's educational environment, students and teachers are juggling a mix of face-to-face, online and blended learning courses. Canvas by Instructure helps teachers navigate these diverse learning experiences with a user-friendly virtual learning environment that offers flexible access to courses and a consistent learning experience, all while streamlining everyday teaching processes. The world's best schools and universities are using Canvas to create dynamic courses, collaborate seamlessly, and access actionable data that drives student success.
On the 24th to the 26th of January 2024, Bet UK is back, and even better for educators. New for 2024, Table Talks empowers educators to collaborate openly and connect deeply with like-minded individuals in the education space, as well as tech user labs, the brilliant new tutorials and working groups at Bet, where technology users will learn how to get more out of their institution's tech from the top education technology experts in the world. Whatever your goal, you'll find it at Bet 2024. Educators go free. Get your tickets today at www.uk.betshow.com/visitor-registration.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
The big political news this week was the launch of the DFE in England's consultation on how best to implement minimum levels of service in schools if teaching and support staff unions go on strike. The BBC reports that education unions who were involved in talks with government over MSLs called the announcement shameful. One of the two options being put forward is to guarantee that vulnerable children, those due to take exams, children of critical workers and all primary school pupils can go into school on strike days. A leaked DfE document suggests that this amounts to 74% of pupils. In October, Education Secretary Gillian Keegan said MSLs would be introduced with the unions on a voluntary basis at first. But the government could use legal powers brought in earlier this year under the Strikes Act. The DfE says the plans will protect education. The consultation will last 9 weeks. All 4 teaching unions involved in talks reacted angrily to the announcement. Much of the media focus in recent days has been on the inquest into the death of Ruth Perry. The Guardian featured a report focusing on comments made by colleagues of the late head teacher, which focused on her evident distress during the days of the inspection. Much has been made of comments from Ofsted inspectors that Mrs. Perry was upset, tearful, and looked like she was in pain. The inquest began after Mrs. Perry's family discovered that its bid for legal aid had been rejected, but a crowdfunding campaign saw donations totalling more than £63,000. Behaviour in schools has also been a hot topic on both sides of the England-Scotland border. The Dunfermline Press reported that Fife Council's education chiefs are trying to curb a rise in violence in schools, but they don't believe in negative consequences. Instead, children learning about bullying should be an empowering experience. In a new version of the anti-bullying policy, the aim is stated that children do not bully others because they understand the harm it causes and choose not to cause such harm. It goes on to say where children do choose to bully, we need to engage with them educationally, supportively and restoratively rather than punitively. Comments on the paper's website, however, appear to show disapproval of the policy, with one comment describing it as utter nonsense and another saying it was psychobabble. The draft policy has been issued to head teachers, guidance staff and educational psychologists for their views, before schools are asked to create a personalised policy for their setting based on the final draft. Meanwhile, over the border in England, The Guardian reports that head teachers are describing a culture of non-compliance among pupils and parents. Whereas once a parent who was called into school to discuss concerns was likely to be broadly supportive of teachers' decisions, now heads are saying parents more often side with their child and take to social media to register their feelings. Many heads also say that behaviour has changed from having to deal with lesson disruption to managing internal truancy, as pupils come to school to socialise but refuse to attend lessons to learn. Some leaders also highlighted an increase in verbal abuse and swearing. Head teachers also pointed out that whilst challenging behaviour is nothing new, non-compliance is on the increase, and the reduction in the availability of specialist support services has made matters worse. One leader summed up the current situation. Since COVID, people seem to be far less tolerant, and that includes pupils and parents. Popular quiz show University Challenge is in the news as the BBC reports that a Christmas episode has been pulled after 2 contestants complained about a lack of provision for their disabilities. According to the report, contestants were not provided with promised audio description for visual images or subtitles to help with audio processing. The BBC agreed to withdraw the episode after the complaints were received. Finally, the BBC features a report on a civil servant who quit her Whitehall job to retrain as a teacher. The former employee of the DfE began teacher training in 2022, and Ms Melbourne is just one example of over 35s joining the profession, according to charity New Teach. Research suggests that recent graduates are shunning the profession, but older people are stepping up to fill the gap. Figures also suggest that older starters stay in the profession longer than the national average and are more representative of society in terms of gender and ethnicity. Could this be a solution to a recruitment crisis? This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
You are listening to the Friday Morning Break with John Gibbs on Teachers Talk Radio. My guest this week, Professor Gwyn Bevan. We are discussing, how did schools get to be like this? Yes, fascinating. Another. So earlier I said, I thought my father was a sort of Labour trades unionist guy in the 1970s. He said to me, there are some things the government has to do. That's like schools, education, health, so on. And the commanding heights. He was a great believer in nationalisation. Commanding heights of the economy. That's government should do that. He acknowledged that markets do things like Marks and Spencer's and selling you underpants and things, and that would be the best for them things to do. A mixed economy. And so I thought I took that on board. Yes, schools and health and public services and other things and essential services are best provided by the government and somehow socialised in some way. One way round that, one way they squared the circle by saying acknowledging that, was to create these sort of mimicking markets, these pseudo markets. So you got within the health service, and one thing I saw in schools was, okay, the parents can't move around. Okay, you can't build the new schools like mushrooms all over the place. But if your school starts to fail, there'll be someone on your case called Ofsted. The teachers will be able to see this, and within the school itself, teachers there'll be performance related pay. You'll be in competition not only with each other, but between schools, as if you were a market. Okay, the parents will at least punish you by thinking of you as a poor school. And the trusts were the answer. Schools would then have a big degree of autonomy. But my view is it hasn't worked.
I mean, the view of modern economics is that it's wrong to think you should nationalise the commanding heights of the economy. But the distinction you should make is where markets work and where they don't work. So broadly speaking, I mean, it's more complicated than this, but basically, nationalising steel and nationalising coal doesn't seem to make sense because these satisfy characteristics of a market working. But healthcare, the issue that we have with healthcare and schools, there's this sadly, an impenetrable economist called Oliver Williamson, who I try and translate into English in my books, one of my missions in life, basically. And he analyses causes of market failure. He uses this particularly impenetrable language. So the phrase he uses that no one can understand is called site asset specificity, really. And what that means is you want a local service, you want a local post office, you want a local school, you want a local hospital, local surgery. As you say, when you buy your underpants from Marks and Spencer's, it doesn't really matter where they're produced. That actually, where the school is and where the hospital is and where the post office is vitally important for you. And so the whole thing that makes markets work is there's lots of competition. Once you introduce this requirement for services to be local, you remove one of the key elements to make the market work. The reason why the market can work for coal and steel is there are lots of producers all over the place. You don't have to live, you get into. So that's the key difference. And that's why the market won't work. Now, the other point I argue in my book, this comes from me working for the first NHS Quality Inspectorate, which was called the Commission for Health Improvement. Tony Blair used to describe it as an Ofsted for the NHS, basically. It was a label we sought to distance ourselves from. This is back in the early 2000s. What I got to understand is it was called the Commission for Health Improvements. The idea is you go in and offer the enable hospital to improve. But there's this big difference in healthcare, but it applies in all public services: quality assurance and quality improvement. So quality assurance is just, is this hospital a safe place for, you, your mother, or children to go to? That's quality assurance. It's, so I think, and we could do that. What we couldn't do was help hospitals improve as well. That's not, you either do quality assurance, which is this is like the police inspectorate coming in which people will be naturally very defensive and concerned, like this case about headmasters committing suicide. I mean, this is the police coming in. You can't expect the police to help you improve performance. It's a collegial learning environment. So what we got to understand is that's all we could do, and we can't do the other thing. We need to organise that completely differently. So, and I know there's this debate now about Ofsted not being fit for purpose and the inspections on. I mean, what I would say, my view is, you know much more about schools than I do, but that Ofsted should limit itself to a relatively simple mission, which is this school failing or not? Is it okay to send your children to this school? And that could have a very streamlined, very simple set of inspections. It shouldn't put the fear of God into schools, because you should only fear Ofsted if you are providing a truly awful educational experience. But to get improvement, you need a completely different basis. And that's where it was the London Challenge, where you get a network of schools sharing performance, learning from each other. And I think the way we've got, what happens in this country is, as you know, John, very well, is governments get terribly worried about failure, and they introduce systems to deal with failure. What we do not do is develop systems to enable people to improve and perform better and learn from the best.
Yeah, I can't agree with you more of that. One of the experiences I felt was a change in the whole attitude to teachers. I famously described, I think it was Michael Gove as the blob, or you certainly may have described this public services generally as a blob, and that kind of intractable lot who resist change and so on. And whatever truth there might have been in that, the answer was disciplinary. So the market wasn't just seen as a way of creating innovation; it was a way of punishing. It was the lame ducks. I forget who first used that. We won't support the lame ducks in industry, and we'll let the schools go to the wall. Although that was nonsense. Ofsted and its culture was disciplinary. It was to root out the bad uns. So it didn't come into school looking to help, as you say. It came into school to find out what you were up to.
See, the other thing which is this truly devastating finding, it's from OECD, where they did this international comparison of literacy and numeracy skills of it's children aged 16 to 19. I think this is about 2010 they did this survey, but it's only been analysed recently and published by OECD. So it's children who are 16 to 19 in 2010, with those who would be 65 to 70, or 60 to 65 years. So what they're comparing here is literacy and numeracy of those who have been through all the reforms with which you are familiar, which is Ofsted, quasi-market, and so on, back to people who went through schools 40 years ago under the old so-called failing system of the Attlee settlements. Now, in all countries they looked at, except one, the children aged 16 to 19 have higher literacy and numeracy scores than those aged 60 to 65. Guess which the exception is? It's England. So it's this truly terrible thing that, the young children we had, that they'll now be 10 years on, were worse in literacy and numeracy than their grandparents.
Yeah, well, there's an awful. Anyone listening to this of a certain age will go, yes, I knew young uns couldn't add up and spell. That of course, that's a terrible insight into a process that's been going on what 30 odd years or so or more, and has actually harmed. It not only did not work in its own terms, producing greater efficiency and greater choice and all those things, but it actually has done harm. Curious. We should come to that conclusion. Will we look back on the Thatcher to this experiment as a blip? In other words, what will inevitably, as you were talking about, the best way to manage to improve schools is to talk about school improvement. To go, the old school inspectors and the school, what they used to call the advisory teachers. When local authorities provided advisory teachers, they said this is the best practice, and they'd work with schools that were struggling to try and improve them. So, well, that's cooperative. Are we going to? Will historians of the future say yes? You can mark off 1980 to something to about 2020, whatever, and say this was a period when this happened, and it was a kind of aberration. Are we going to be going back to the past in some respects?
No, well, the thing is, I would hope people would regard it as an aberration. This was an experiment that didn't work. Whatever phrase you want to use to describe it. But I don't think we can go back to the past, because basically that's what it seems to me is what Wales has tried to do. And actually, they get the worst results in PISA of any country in the United Kingdom. So you need to move on. And the thing that, Julian and the girl with whom I have disagreements about markets, we both agree that what we can't allow is, as I described what we're told of in our village school here, which is under the Attlee settlement, schools could fail children for generations and no one would intervene or do anything about it. The point is, of course, what we're dealing with here is a very small minority of what happens, and you can't design a system which is, what you're feeling happens. You can't design a system to tackle this small minority. I mean, most people like you, as I said earlier, go into teaching with a sense of mission. This defines me. This is what I am. I'm a teacher, and I educate young children, and it's a fantastic, fulfilling, worthwhile career. And what we need to have systems that recognise that, this is unlike, Michael Gove talking about the blob. It's not the blob. It's a group of amazing people who need to be inspired and encouraged and developed. The thing is, you can't have that if you don't have systems to tackle, schools that are failing, teachers who can't be bothered.
Yes.
You need both things in parallel, but they need to be distinct.
Yeah. I think that's interesting what you said. I was thinking of the way, trying to solve the exceptional cases as if they were more general. I mean, when they introduced ID, you have to show your ID when you go and vote, and so on, to solve a problem that hardly existed. So there's almost no voter fraud, but somehow we introduce a national answer to a tiny problem. So that, when you hear of a school where they play PE all day, or there's a teacher who likes to do nothing at all, that becomes almost like a moral panic. Now we must root this out across the system, where it's actually very, very rare. And another thing that's changed from my teaching career was that I remember when I first started teaching. So this is in the 80s, late 80s, middle 80s, and the exams. People didn't worry too much. I said to a teacher, I'm going to look at the exam results this year of our GCSE and A-level students. Are you really? I'll just find out in September when they come out. Now teachers are desperate to find out their exam results, because exams have become more and more important for students, for teachers, for schools, for all the league tables and so on. So for better or worse, that's a changed environment. And school has become more determining of kids' future. My dad left school in the 40s with no qualifications and did fine. That's not going to happen today. So in a sense, schools have become more significant than they were prior to Thatcher, in a sense, in people's lives.
Yeah, I know. Well, I think, again, one of the things that came through, in this study comparing Wales schools in England and Wales, when Wales stopped publishing school league tables, was the as I remember, I can't remember it was a few years after it had been Wales had stopped publishing school league tables. 5 good grades at GCSE in Wales, it was 30%. Now the point now is, as you're making, point you're making is that not to get 5 good grades at GCSE means a life of at best marginal employment. So we talk about a world that has changed, in which getting good examination results. I mean, it seems to me the pressure that you were describing teachers experiencing about good examination results, reflects the change in the working environment. That if you do not get good educational qualifications, you will not do well.
Absolutely. I mean, as a parent, both my kids went off to school, and I thought, well, the main thing is that they're happy and they have friends and they enjoy their time at school. But of course, as the exams approached, I wanted them to get the best possible grades, because I knew, and what that would mean for them later on. And so, in that sense, yes, I'm going to be deeply affected by the information that schools get terrible results, or the exams aren't very good, or that the environment isn't very good for learning. So
no.
So in that sense, it's not. You're right. It's not. You can't go back to the way it was. So where do where do we go from here? If the neoliberal market forces are coming to an end, and we're going to get a Labour government next, maybe, possibly, more than likely, and somehow there's a shift again, something big, something like we go look back on it and say this is like the Attlee era, this is like Thatcher. Where are we going to shift to? What will it look like?
Yeah, Keir Starmer's better at. I suppose I have a radical vision of the way we should organise government. You see, which is that the whole market school system just isn't. That's not. Just give up on that. But comparing school performance, which is what league tables do, but much more. I mean, I would create bodies similar to but different from local education authorities. I mean, I was talking to a friend of mine. It was this rack in schools, and then head teachers having a few days to sort that out, and the sense in which this is your problem. It's just breathtaking. And this friend of mine who was, he remembers when. I think this is in Oxfordshire. There's this wonderful Chief Education Officer, Tim Brighouse. And he said if he had a problem, he could always see Tim Brighouse. You had to see him at 7 o'clock in the morning, but he would always see you. And now there's no one. This is for you to solve. And I just think you ought to create a body which is above the school. And they could actually organise things like the London Challenge, which is comparing performance, schools learning from each other. And I also would say they ought to have a key role in deciding the funding of a school. I mean, I spent a lot of time on how we use formulae for funding healthcare, populations in healthcare. And we all know what the indicators of need are. The problem we have is knowing how much money to give for the indicators of need. So eligibility for free school meals is a good indicator that this child is in greater educational need than someone who isn't. But how much money you should give for that child, goodness, we don't know that. I mean, it's just plucked. I mean, it seems to me it's just plucked out. This is what we're going to give you for that. And so and we also know in healthcare these formulae work quite well for large populations. If you're up to, I don't know, 100,000, it's okay. But schools, 50 or 100 pupils, no formula is going to give a good assessment as to what they ought to get. So I think, local judgment, you'd know when you go into a school, as to what that school's like, what the challenge is like. You could adjust the formula using judgment. I mean, some use a policy. And then the other thing I'd argue, which everyone thinks we need to do, is to move to devolution to create regional government. So the region will be overseeing these local education authorities, holding them to account. And then I'd see central government as holding regions to account for their performance. The other thing I feel we ought to have, and this is doubtless very controversial, is I think most of what we are called universities ought to move to be under regional governance. So there'll be a few internationally elite universities that exist outside that. But you'd want to put most of the higher education sector within a region so they can work with local employers, get integrated, help develop the economy. And the other thing I feel strongly about is that we've put too much money in Wheat University providing not very good degrees and not enough in the early years of education. I know you've had a podcast on that, about the importance of the early years of education. So you'd want regions to look across what I describe as the educational pathway from the early years right through to university. And in fact, people in mid-career want to go, how much do we want to spend on these different parts of the sector, which no one does at the moment. They all exist in these separate silos.
It seems to me that we have empowered a lot of parents to be quite savvy consumers. They know more about schools than they used to. They can look at league tables for all their worth, and they can look at exam results, but we've not given them really much ability to enact that. As we say, the market doesn't provide them with. It can dissatisfy them, but it can't satisfy them, as it were. But I'm guessing that an awful lot of education systems in the world are locally managed in some way. I mean, whether it's American school boards or it's local education authorities, because it seems just common sense.
Well, the thing is, U.S. states will run a university sector. I mean, that's the other thing that you do then. I mean, part of the levelling up problem is that you've sucked out the attractive jobs out of areas outside London. Of course, all the big government jobs are all in London anyway. But you can create, I mean, just saying, look, you can go back to the region you came from. You can help shape the future. That you can have a key job in developing education. I make them responsible for healthcare. How you revitalise the economy, all those sorts of things. You can create these engines of change, and I think that would be a key part of addressing these huge inequalities we've got.
It might address that very South-centric, London-centric kind of magnet that operates in Britain, as you say, that draws in all the creative people, young people with a degree in something creative. Well, they're going to go to London, aren't they? They inevitably be drawn down to London.
Absolutely.
By that. So we've created that. No wonder that it's the North feels left out. Not only can you not get a train across the country from east to west, but you can't get the jobs and so on.
Well, there's that analysis by it's the Financial Times data analyst, I think John Murdoch, and he looked across different countries about what the contribution of gross domestic product would be if you took out the richest city. And he looked at United States, the Netherlands, and Germany, and it ranges from 1% to 5% in these countries. Then he looked at the United Kingdom, and if you take out London, it falls by 17%. That's 17%. And he also found out that the rest of the UK is as poor as Mississippi. So you've got this. That's all part. I mean, it's not this huge divide you're describing here in terms of London being this magnet. It's just extraordinary.
Yeah, I mean, it's no wonder that you and others are reflecting. How did this happen?
How did Britain come to this? Absolutely, yeah.
How did Britain come to this? It's a state of the nation kind of observation, isn't it? Where did we get to this?
Well, the key point. The thing is that the argument. The reason I look at Germany and Italy is we know there are good historical reasons why there would be geographical inequalities in this country. There's the long-standing north-south divide in Italy, with the south having these varieties of organised crime that make it incredibly difficult to run. Germany's got the legacies of communism, which really held the country back for years. We've got none of those. And yet, we've created inequalities without parallel in Germany and Italy. It's just extraordinary.
That, it seems to me, like we're coming to the end of our discussion now, and it is... we are living through times, not only how did Britain come to this, but how did the world come to this? Because we could look outside of our shores right now and think so much of this looks like the 19th century, not like the 21st century. Yeah. It's a strange old world we do live in. And thank you so much, Professor Gwyn Bevan, and timely insight into how we got where we are. So many, many thanks.
Oh, it's a great pleasure talking to you, John. Yeah.
And that brings to an end this week's episode of the Friday Morning Break with John Gibbs. My guest this week was Professor Gwyn Bevan of the London School of Economics, Professor of Policy Analysis and former head of the Department of Management. And we discussed, among other things, his most recent book, How Did Britain Come to This? A Century of Systematic Failure of Governance. If you enjoyed this episode, you can hear it again as a podcast on Spotify or on the Teachers Talk Radio site. Thank you for listening.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.